Where did they come in the United States?
We had family in Riverdale. And we came by boat. It took about 2 weeks. And they immediately were given an apartment by a richer relative, my father's sister and her husband, who gave them an apartment. Gave them their apartment as they moved to a better apartment. So we were on the ground floor of a building, and that was a building that we wound up staying for. They stayed there about 50 years.
In the same apartment?
In the same building, 3 different apartments.
Oh.
So, refugees once, they didn't want to be refugees again.
So your earliest memories are of growing up in Riverdale.
Growing up in Riverdale, yes.
Where did you go to school?
I went to school, my nursery school was at the Marble Hill Housing Projects off of Broadway. My elementary school was right across the street from the interview location at PS 81. I went to junior high school 141, also in Riverdale, and John F. Kennedy High School, also at the bottom of the Riverdale Hill.
Now, did your older brother go to the same?
He went to PS 81, he went to junior high school 141, and he went to DeWitt Clinton High School, which is also in the Bronx.
Right. Did you have any Jewish education as you were growing up?
Yes. I studied 3 days a week at the Riverdale Jewish Center, which is an Orthodox synagogue in Riverdale.
Were your parents members of that synagogue?
Yes, they were members of that synagogue. They later moved to another synagogue called the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale. But at that time we were members there, and that's where I was bar mitzvahed.
How did they observe Judaism in the home? Were they kosher?
We were kosher, and we were kosher, and we kind of had our own way of celebrating Shabbat, the Sabbath. We'd go to synagogue most of the time. We didn't really drive or anything like that, but of course we didn't have a car. For the most part, my mother was very observant, but the one thing she could never give up was the telephone. She loved talking with family on Saturday mornings.
What family did you have in the area? You mentioned your father's sister and her husband. Did
Yes.
you have other family?
Oh yes, there was. My father had another brother and his wife here, and actually another brother and his wife. There were, cousins. He had a niece living here already. So there was a number of family here, and they were all in the tailoring business here in Riverdale. At one point, there were 3 different tailoring shops, all owned by extended members of the Adler family.
Had these relatives gone through what your father went through, or something similar gone through the camps?
Obviously they lost their parents just like my father and so on, but I got the sense, and I've never heard all of their stories, but for the most part I got the sense that the surviving members, right? My father came from a family of 9, so 5 survived. My father and 4 others survived. And one of them lost his first, one of the surviving uncles, my father's brother, lost his first wife in the war and some kids, and then remarried but never had more children. The other ones who survived, it was my sense that they were never in concentration camp. I think they had, for that time would be called lucky by getting into work camps or labor camps, which was a easier deal than, being in a concentration camp.
Did you ever feel that you were missing something, not having grandparents? Were you aware of what grandparents were and that you didn't have them?
From time to time, when I'd see other people with their grandparents, it was kind of, that would bring a deep sadness within me from time to time. My mother tried so much. She had an elderly aunt named Peppy Nanny, and she tried to build up this elderly aunt as like a grandparent figure to me, but it was very hard to communicate with her. She knew no English, She was here in the Bronx, but she knew no English, and you know. So it never felt the same, you know.
Were you named after someone who had perished?
Actually, no. I was, my brother was, my brother Yehuda was named after his grandfather, my father's father, Yehuda. But I was not. My name Arnon is after a very lovely waterfall that flows into the Dead Sea in Israel.
Now, when you were growing up, did your mother work or just your father?
Both of them worked.
And did she work in tailoring also?
No, she never worked in tailoring. That was not for her. She loved working with children. So she worked in daycare and nursery schools. For many years, she worked at a nursery school in a housing project in the South Bronx. And it was just amazing. As the neighborhood got rougher and rougher, she kept going. She was a substitute, but it seemed that she was there at least 3-4 days a week, from my recollection.
And what about your father? Did he work long hours?
Oh, yeah. He worked crazy hours. He worked, at first, like 2 or 3 different jobs. He had a day job in the garment district in Manhattan. And I remember sometimes I'd be so desperate to see him, I would wait at the bus stop as he came up the hill into Riverdale from the subway. And I'd wait for him just so I could see him a little before he would walk off to one of his brother's tailoring shops. So he would work there a couple more hours.
So he wasn't home for dinner?
No. Eva Vader, later on we'd wait for him. But, when I was young, I didn't see him much. When I was a little kid, I used to actually fall asleep and then wake up in time to see him a little, again, because, I'd miss him.
What are your early memories of your parents?
Boy. Yeah, they, first of all, they always had strong European accents, but a lot of people did in our neighborhood. Our neighborhood was filled with German Jews and other Eastern European Jews, some of whom had, left before the Holocaust, some who left, who survived. But my parents, they were always a little on the outs with everybody else. They never quite fit right in, and I have a strong recollection of that. There was many times my mom, I remember, who's a lovely person and loves friends and loves people, had a lot of difficulty making friends. My father similarly had difficulty making friends. His only real friends were his family, of which he had a kind of complicated connection with, right? There was some anger, right? They had an easier ride. He was the one who had stayed with his parents, and gone to Auschwitz. They didn't. So it was always kind of a complicated thing. They were his employer. My father never owned his own shop, right? So my recollection of my father is that he was very, very angry. So often. Angry. Sometimes he would come home, he was tired, he was exhausted, and he would shout so that the walls would shake about this or that, where's dinner, this apartment's a mess. My mother was much more even about it, but yet she was very resilient and very stubborn and, could definitely hold her own.
Do you know if they had nightmares?
Oh, yeah, they had serious nightmares. It used to be so often, it'd be nighttime at some hour, and, I was always terrified walking by their room to, have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, because if they hear any creak, my mother would start screaming, "Apukam, Apukam," calling out to my father, because, she was terrified at the sound. My father would often wake up choking, like he had swallowed some saliva, and he would wake up after some nightmare choking. As I got older, he explained to me that most of his nightmares were actually, maybe fortunately, maybe not, but based on difficult experiences he had in Israel, believe it or not. And if you ever talk to him now, unfortunately, he compares some of the incidents which happened to him in Israel with some of the things that happened during the Holocaust. It's kind of complicated. My mother, her nightmares, when she was asleep, she told me her nightmares was always of being 17 years old again, being on the streets of Budapest, not knowing where she was going to get her next meal, and always in fear of being denounced or caught by the Nazis. So they did have a lot of nightmares.
When you were a child, did you know much about what they had gone through? Had they talked to you about it?
A lot less back then than now. But, it was only in more recent years, and I can explain about that whenever you want, that I really began to understand it more fully.
So when you were a child tiptoeing by the room, you didn't know why they were having nightmares?
I knew, again, that they were different. I knew that things just weren't right. I had no grandparents. They had this strong Hungarian accents. I know they had been in Israel and had come. I knew so many of these things, but I guess occasionally what would happen is my father, sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay.
Sometimes my father, we'd be eating dinner on the few times we were together, and most often he didn't talk about anything, but every now and then, without any chronological sequence or anything, right? We didn't, he could have picked any incident in time, and I didn't know where it was from, and he would start telling a story about something that happened to him. And he always say, I'm just going to tell you this, and, this is nothing compared to what really happened to me. And I go, and he would never, say the full thing. And, even now, he's Baruch Hashem, God willing, he's going to be 90 years old in a week, and there's still things that he refuses to tell me, But at that time, so it'd be a story every now and then at the kitchen table.
Did you ask any questions about the story, or did you feel you could ask questions?
As a kid, you just don't connect that way. It's almost like, he's talking about this again or something like that, and you just kind of listen. It was only later that I started asking him more questions.
Did he discuss any of it? Did you overhear him or your mother discussing anything with their relatives or friends?
When they were very good when they didn't want me to understand something, like so many parents of all ethnicities, right? They were very good at speaking in a foreign language. And my parents could choose from Hungarian or Hebrew. My father, when he was speaking to relatives, could choose from Hungarian or Yiddish. Sometimes he could even speak a little German or Russian, depending on who he wanted to talk to. So they were very good at what they wanted me to hear and what they didn't want me to hear. Because they would speak to each other in, Hungarian usually. And then when the relatives would come over, and, we were to a certain extent close, his brothers and their wives would come over, mostly from his side, and they would be shouting and screaming and laughing and crying, and all of it was in Hungarian. So I don't know what they were talking about. If I venture to guess, I would bet they probably didn't talk that much about it. Because people back then just didn't, growing up in the 1960s.
But your father
and 70s.
would come out with isolated stories, and you never knew when it was going to happen.
Never.
Now your mother didn't tell you anything.
She was such a sweetheart. When she'd talk, she would tell me happy stories about her childhood from Hungary. She tried to really make my life, more normal in that way. She'd talk about her friend Margit. She would talk about this one or that one. She would talk about more normal experiences. And occasionally she would talk about something, from the time. But it was much more, she always tried to view things positively. My father, when he would talk about his childhood, It was very negative. And in fact, even now he has difficulty separating childhood growing up in a very anti-Semitic village from Nazi occupation and the Holocaust. You know, all kinds of melds in for him. You know.
When you were an elementary school age, what kinds of friends did you have? Were they other Jewish children, or were it mostly family members' children?
You know, it's so funny. I grew up in a neighborhood that was like, at that time, around 238th Street and Greystone Avenue off of Riverdale Avenue. And the neighborhood was like half Jewish and half Irish. And I had friends who were both Jewish, you know, whose parents were usually German Jewish, even though they didn't seem to be having the same background as my parents. And I was also friends with some of the Irish boys. You know, but they were a lot tougher and they liked to fight more and stuff like that than we did. You know, so
They
it was,
didn't, did they go to the 81, or did they go to the Catholic schools in the area?
a couple of them went to Catholic school, but a few of them went to 81. Actually, a couple of the Irish boys somehow went to Fieldston, a private school. And, you know, most of the Jewish boys were in the PS 81 with me and 141.
Did you ever bring the kids over to your house?
Yeah, I did bring the kids over to my house, you know, and it seemed very natural to do that.
And they never asked why your parents have an accent? Or
You know what, they never, again, even the Irish kids didn't ask. Again, they were probably used to it too, you know. It seemed like
So many
everybody in
people.
my neighborhood had an accent
Right.
of some sort. Exactly.
Now, when you were growing up, when you were young, did you have a favorite holiday? Favorite Jewish holiday?
A favorite Jewish holiday growing up? Oh, definitely Hanukkah, right? Because I'd get presents. And it was nice because my father would be home to light candles, you know, and he would light the candles and we'd sing a song or two. And then I got one present, you know, none of this like 8 presents that they do now that I do for my kids.